Everyone can be seated there. Okay, this is this group is panel Science for Summits, and we've got some great folks lined up here. But I'll introduce Maura Longden here, the moderator. She's a former National Park Service climbing ranger and wilderness manager, and has specialized in climbing management for 25 years. She continues to work with Park Service NPS managers and climbing rangers on climbing management planning, best practices of impact, mitigation, and education. Maura?
Thank you. In addition to being the moderator, I guess my more important job is timekeeper today to make sure we get out of here and get some lunch. So we'll shoot for about 12:15. First, I just want to introduce the nature of the panel here. In the mountain regions around the world, scientists are studying resources and changing resource conditions due to both the natural and human-caused processes. And so on the Sustainable Science for Sustainable Summits panel, we'll hear from scientists from various disciplines today, and you'll have a chance to ask questions and learn more about their important projects. I have questions for the panel. Given the fact that we're going to do this in a condensed amount of time, I'd like to hold questions from the audience till the end, and then we'll just sort of move things along and get out of here and grab our lunches at that point. At this time, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Just about a minute with your background and projects, the regions you might be working in, and any materials if you have a poster or anything that folks can look at after the session.
My name's Doug Whittaker, and I'm a researcher and planner, works out of Anchorage, Alaska, for a small firm. We're 2 people. We do studies on rivers, so I'm not a climber, but I'm here to talk about how we have some parallels to alpine settings, or some things that are similar, some things that are different. And I'm sort of a social scientist, so I'm sort of representing the citizen science side that might be used in social science, so collecting data about values, attitudes, behaviors, things of that nature.
I'm Mike Loso. I'm a professor at Alaska Pacific, giving a talk tomorrow afternoon about travels in glaciers. I'm actually a glaciologist, and so I teach and do research about sort of background, more so than in Denali, in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is twice as big and has about 1/10 of the budget. And so one perspective I bring is manage big problems.
I got into, after failing my assistant alpine guide exam, the Canadian Association of Mountain Guides, and I now work as a consultant for a large organics waste management company called Harvest and Remote Site Toilet Systems.
Hi, I'm Lapham. 4 years ago, I co-founded the American Climber Science Program that brings scientists with significant research needs up in high mountain regions into the regions with volunteer climbers to go and access and gather data over a long term that would give us good indicators of a whole ecosystem. And for instance, in Peru, we've been working for 4 years, and we've gathered data on everything from spectral analysis of the air column at various elevations on peaks to the, and you'll hear that from Carl, the black carbon on the glaciers, to health of climbers and volunteers ascending to very high altitudes, to the effect of grazing in the national parks in Peru on vegetation and things especially now important, water quality and water availability that relate a lot to we also have expanded. We had a team in Nepal this spring looking at some subset of similar conditions, and we did the first sea-to-sea transect of Costa Rica from the Pacific to the Atlantic, which you don't think of. I gather, I wasn't on that trip, but I gather it was extremely strenuous going across and gathering the data. So we try to put the science to work in the service of the countries where we're actually
My name is Carl Schmitt. I work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I've been involved with the climate science program that Ellen has been co-directing. I'm, I guess, the scientific advisory chair at this time. The main project that I work on is a project looking at black carbon impacts on the glaciers and how that's potentially accelerating the mass loss. And appropriate to this discussion here, yes, the climate science program is kind of a hybrid citizen science program, and we've gotten some really good data that's gotten some really high level international attention. So I'd like to be able to share some of that information with you.
Hi, my name is Kenny Wallen. I go to Texas A&M University, where I'm a PhD student in human dimensions of natural resource management. I climb with Carl and Ellen on the climate science program. And specifically, I have my poster up there, which is just understanding kind of attitudes and perceptions of climate change among mountaineers. And hopefully, over the next year or two, we'll be expanding that kind of to get a better understanding of local stakeholders there in Peru in terms of their perceptions of climate change. In general, I'm a social scientist as well. My doctoral research works with normative behaviors and social influences and stuff like that. So I'm kind of doing a hybrid crossover thing here with the climate science program because I myself, obviously, I'm a climber, love doing it, and love being able to do science and climate at the same time. So that's what I'm doing. Thanks.
Well, so to begin our discussion of science in mountain environments, we do have three people here who are involved with the American Climber Science Program, ACSP. So my first question is for you. What is the, we've heard a little bit about this, but if you go a little more in depth for us, what is the value of citizen science, and how have climbers been involved in these projects?
I'll take that one right off. I've gone down for 3 expeditions so far. I'm actually leaving in a week from now on my 4th expedition. And in the times that I've been down to Peru to do my sampling, I've climbed myself 5 peaks total, something like that, and probably collected myself a total of 40 samples. Through the Climber Science program, we have samples from 15 different mountains, 3 different years on a lot of those mountains, and 250 different samples collected from those mountains. So basically, well, you know, the techniques that I've developed for this program are not the highest tech techniques. They're really still pretty solid. We lose a little bit in quality, but we gain a lot in coverage. And that's been one of the really big advantages of this program for the research that I'm leading. So that's.
Ellen or Kenny, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think what Carl said is true, but one of the things that we who were not the principal science investigators learned, because we were contributing the logistics, the planning, the fundraising, the public relations, the working with other organizations, including the Alpine Club, which was very supportive of this program in its initial stages, and other people who would have an interest in the kind of work we're doing. I've learned that you just don't go out and do science when you're in the field in remote locations. We've spent, and I know Carl certainly has, spent quite a bit of time refining our field techniques so that he can get the leverage he needs from the volunteer citizen scientist or climber science in the field. So I mean, we even had a discussion about whether you could use an ISAC case. You know, it has to do with contamination of the sample, because we can't use metals when we're doing water sampling, because that will affect the assay of the water that takes place in the lab, because you're introducing a metal into the water. But can we use metal for snow? I mean, we have these very fine discussions about techniques in the field, but I think the thing is that we're doing 2 things I think are great. One is we're really leveraging science in places where the science actually getting that knowledge on the ground can really make a substantial difference. And I think Peru is a good case in point for this. So that's one. And the other is a lot of us are coming back as advocates for not just science in the field, but also for for what we're observing. As was pointed out, talking about Karsten's pyramid, we're interacting with a community of people in Peru. We're not just helicoptering in and helicoptering out. We're there for months at a time, and so we're developing relationships with the science community there, with students. We have an active with farmers, and guides. So as I say, there's an ecosystem of community that's around the science program now. It's not just pure science.
Can you do peer caliber science with volunteers?
Yes.
Peer review caliber?
Yes.
Yeah.
The climate science program has been pretty much all volunteer up to now. So those of us working on it, we have our full-time jobs in addition. So it's taken a little while, but I have a peer-reviewed or a journal article that I'm about to submit. I hope to actually have it submitted before today. That's going to be one of my higher level journal publications in my career. It's going to a really good journal, and I've gotten really, really good feedback from it when I've passed it out to some experts in the field. So I think it should go through peer review, hopefully without too much difficulty, but yes, you definitely can. You know, you have to be really good about making sure your techniques are high quality, reproducible, and simple, especially if it's, you know, if you're just sending people off to do these measurements. It has to be something that people can wrap their minds around, wrap their hands around, and do it and feel like they're doing things comfortably. But yeah, if the techniques are good and simple and it's easy for people to do, yeah, I think you can.
Yeah, and given that the climate science program is framed as a citizen science program, the people on the program are willing to learn and able to learn the techniques that we need to use to collect data, whether it's, you know, from a natural scientist perspective or from a social science perspective. So that's one of the benefits of framing it as a citizen science program, is that the people, the volunteers on the program, are more than willing and obviously capable of collecting the data that we need to get.
I'm going to see if we can fit in one question from the audience regarding citizen science. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask the panel? We'll come back to that at the end then. I'm going to move into a different area here. In the mountain regions around the world, impacts from recreational use, development to support tourism, and regional expansion due to population increase are affecting resources and character to varying degrees. According to some social scientists, changing human behaviors is the key to resolving many conservation problems. So my next question is for the audience. It's time to wake up. With a show of hands now, how many of you assume that once people know that their behaviors are actually negatively impacting the environment, they'll stop? How many assume that? If you know that your behavior is negatively impacting the environment, you'll stop that behavior. A couple of folks? How many people don't assume that at all? All right, let's ask the social scientists. So panelists, can you give us an example of how changing attitudes have led to a change in the behavior that have lessened impact to the mountain, to a mountain environment, improved the visitor experience, or created safer climbing conditions? Doug, you want to take that one?
Well, sure. And so I'm not going to talk about mountains so much because I don't have much data about that. But obviously, human waste management in river settings predated some of the stuff you guys are doing on mountains. And people have been packing out their waste on river trips for a couple of decades now in some places, and certainly for a decade in others. And it was something that it didn't come with just education, and it actually comes in large part with regulation first, behavior to follow, then it gets subsumed into their attitudes and values. So attitudes follow the behavior rather than the other way around. That's something that social scientists talk about a lot. And sometimes that occurs. It can come from both directions. But with regard to science about that, one of the interesting things, so as social scientists, the things we're studying are people's ideas in their heads or their behaviors. So we can ask people on these trips to tell us about stuff they did or stuff that they're thinking about. And we have to ask them, either when they get back or before they go, in some cases, but sometimes we need to find out what they're doing actually out there, and that's why the study the other day from the Everest and K2, from the guy from Sweden, I'm sorry, I forget his name, is incredible, but he sent a team up there to do that. And sometimes we just have to ask the guys to remember their trip. And so, are they good at that, doing that? It goes back to the stuff Carl was saying. It's got to be simple, and it's got to be easy for them to do, and it can't take away from their other activities, which are more important to them, like getting to the summit or whatnot. So, if you're asking them to collect observation data or something on their trips, it better be easy to do. On rivers, the biggest technological fix we found was getting this was to get river rangers to record stuff, was getting it into a small enough sized notebook, Write in the Rain notebook, that fit in their chest pocket so they would take it out when they saw the activity. And you know, it's a small thing like that. Now with climbing, you guys got no fingers. I don't know how you're gonna write, but anyway, you got some interesting challenges, I think.
Yeah, I agree with what Doug's saying. A lot of times people will assume that attitudes do equate to behavior, but in a large part of the social sciences, that's kind of debated. And as Doug said, behaviors tend to change attitudes more than the other way around. But it's interesting, your question, because in a lot of instances, it's not just a cognitive fix of attitudes and behaviors, but as Doug pointed out, like a technological fix, or even something as simple as a structural fix like signs or any sort of other objects, targets, something that the National Park Service, say for instance, can put on trails or somewhere for people to see and utilize, where it becomes sort of an object where they kind of like, okay, that's what I need to do, so I'm going to do that. So it's not necessarily changing attitudes as much as kind of understanding attitudes, and as Doug pointed out, values and belief systems as well, because it's just really just a big complex of everything working together within the context, because it's not going to be the same in every environment. So it's not going to be the same with river systems and waste management as it is with mountains and waste management. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples. I mean, the trail signs and stuff like that are some of the better examples of it working to impact attitudes and actual behaviors, but then also there are instances of those signs actually doing the complete opposite, where you tell people to stay on the trail with the signs and they tend to go off the trail because of the signs. So it's interesting. Not to get into too much, but it's an interesting debate within the social sciences and an interesting discussion to have. As terms.
I'll have to correct that. The question went to everyone out there about human behavior, and if we know that we're damaging the environment, is that the particular wording? Is it going to change our behavior? What do we do that doesn't damage the wilderness places we're going to? Is there anything we do that contributes to the ecosystem connectivity of the wilderness areas we're going to? Let's bring it to an example. I live in Vancouver. I'm going to go climbing in Squamish. Let's say I have the average of everything, so I have an average car. I'm going to drive up there, and I'm going to burn fossil fuels on the way, contributing to climate change, eventually modifying that ecosystem, and modifying it all the time. We're in a state of rapid climate change, as one example. Or I'm going to go hike on some trails, and I'm not contributing to the growth of plants or much connectivity. If anything, I'm attempting to leave no trace. But really, am I having an impact? Absolutely, always. So it seems like I would agree with most people's vote on that one, that we're not that reliable in not damaging ecosystems, because just about everything we do has a negative impact, and that's the state of our culture. That's the state of humans versus environment as like a very fundamental challenge for mostly our own society, ultimately. And flux and change happens in the natural world over millions, thousands, hundreds of years, you know, minutes, hours. And ultimately, whether our society lasts to be hundreds of years or not. But should we ever actually find out what it means to be sustainable, we would be thinking, how are we contributing to the connectivity in this place? And I don't know, I can't think of an example about how I would go and do that. All I try and do is minimize my impact and everything. But it's a different paradigm, it's a different perspective.
Well, are humans part of the ecosystem or not is one of those, we're going into real deep philosophy here, but you know, sometimes people will say, well, we're part of the ecosystem. Some of our impacts are okay. That's part of what the ecosystem is about, and it's dynamic. And some people would say, and nature doesn't care. It doesn't care that we've let dandelions grow everywhere. The dandelions like it just fine. The things they're replacing don't. And it's a value judgment as the so-called stewards of the planet. It's a value judgment about whether or not we think this new state is worse or better than the other one. I'm not saying I hold that. I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate. But anyway, those are some ultimate viewpoints there.
Ben?
There was some paper that was published by some researchers from Colorado State that looked at changing behavior in terms of legotrace. It wasn't a mountaineering sample, but it was from Rocky Mountain National Park. It looked at attitudes, perceptions, self-described knowledge of legotrace, and perceived difficulty. And what they found was that if people understood why the recommendations were effective in protecting the environment, they were more likely to practice those. It was more of a driver in the attitude, it was more important than perceptions of difficulty, and it was more important than self-described knowledge. So the notion of having people understand the nature of the impact they're creating and why it's an issue, at least in this sample, was more of a driver of behavior in the future.
So correlation or causation there is, I guess, my question.
That's what
I think they go together, no doubt. So I think that's good, but I don't know which one caused it, and I think that's the endless debate in our
Yeah.
field.
Well, I think I'm familiar with that paper. I think that's Vasky and Manfredo because they have the human dimensions of wildlife up there. And so they do, sorry, I'm gonna get academic on everybody, but they do structural equation modeling with a lot of other stuff, so it's more like a causation pathway with stuff. But yeah, it is still within the sciences, within the social sciences is the debate. It's the chicken or the egg. But I like how they frame that because it really is. If you get people to understand and explain more about what's going on and why it needs to be done, it legitimizes the behavior and the need for the behavior or whatever it is that we're trying to do. So I think a lot of stuff within what we're talking about, we've talked about like the participatory consensus planning and stuff like that. It is kind of legitimizing that process for the decision making, for the implementation of these regulations and enforcing these regulations. So getting more people involved, understanding the values and beliefs and attitudes of everybody to, again, legitimize it and increase the understanding of why it needs to be done or why it doesn't need to be done is of vast importance, I think.
Let's take one more question now, and then we'll have more at the end of the session. Over here in the back.
So, from a marketing perspective, I'm always looking at the demographic, psychographic aspects of any of this. And I feel like I look around the room, and there are fairly few millennials here in this room. So, and when we're looking even at the club, at the Maura Mountain Club, working with our conservation projects, things like that, we're having to find where we market and try to get volunteers for things to change behaviors. From each of your perspectives, where are you starting to look at your demographics instead of a kind of broader range, specifically in each of your work and what maybe has and hasn't worked when dealing with millennials? Because they need a little bit more, I find, give me something. I'm going to give you, you give me. Where have you found that in each of your works?
Well, as a social scientist, I do survey research, so I ask them questions and usually they answer, but they often lie. So I have to be careful what their answer is. And I think that with the new breed of people, so we've changed our survey research techniques dramatically in the last 2 decades. We used to do only mail surveys or on-site surveys. then we switched for a little while to phone surveys. That's completely unworkable anymore at getting a random sample. And we're back out in the field. I think it's a good thing that to talk to people in the field is the best way to find out what's going on. It's right when things are happening. But you do have to talk to them differently. And I don't want to get into disparaging comments or whatever, but attention spans are lower for the old people too. Everybody's attention span is gone. If we could talk to them by texting, we might get more information. But anyway, there's lots of issues like that come up, and new generations react in different ways. And if you don't adjust, you won't learn stuff. And they're coming up with new attitudes, often very pro-environment attitudes, until it's interfering with some other goal that they have, and that's the other big driver of, when does an attitude change a behavior if there's nothing else getting in the way? So.
Thank you. We'll come back to more questions about the social science aspects here, but I'm going to move on to a different topic. So let's talk for a moment about some of the challenges of conducting science and applying it to the protection of resources and management of visitor use. Is there a disconnect between scientists and land managers, and how can they communicate more effectively?
Yeah, okay, I'll
The
take a
answer
stab
is
at that.
yes.
I think the answer is
Answer is
yes.
no.
There is.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of ways to go after that disconnect, but I think one of them is really, it's simple. It amounts to getting, I mean, I'm not going to say scientists, but people who have some knowledge about the resource and the impacts of behavior on the resource. So that can be local folks, climbers, guides, scientists, whoever it is that has some knowledge to share, getting them in the same room with the decision makers. And I think that conversation is surprisingly not difficult. It's surprisingly rare that occurs. And we heard some talks today, this morning, about the importance of that. And so, I just want to echo that. The last point that Paul made in his 5 lessons learned from Denali was that the implementers need to talk with the planners. And one of the things I've seen, particularly with the Park Service in Alaska, is that, at least my perception is, there's been sort of a professionalization of planning, meaning there's people whose job is, and even more than that, professionalization of public process. There's people who are hired to be planners or to conduct public meetings. It's their job. We've sort of specialized to the point where it's their job to go and talk to the public, to the scientists, to the climbers, to the guides. But they're not oftentimes the decision makers. And so there's a process where, with the land management, information and maybe writes it down in a really well-written document. And in the rent, I think that's unfortunate. That the sort of public dialogue resides within a position or a particular job description. I think it's really important that all of the persons within the land management agency are accessible to the public, to the scientists, to the climbers, the guides, and I think all of us have a responsibility, not just the land management agencies, to help make sure that those